It's hard to believe that in just a few weeks, I'll be returning to the parliament of the world's religions, and this time by the grace of God as a presenter. Now, if you've never heard of it, it goes all the way back to 1893, and it's the largest interfaith gathering in the world. Now, I'd won a scholarship to the last one in Salt Lake City in 2015. And to this day, I cite it as one of the most incredible experiences of my whole life. I knew then and there that I wanted to do interfaith work for the rest of my life and that it was going to be a major, major part of my ministry. You know, I was just so inspired, and I learned so much. But there was one thing that I learned there that I'm not too proud to admit, and it's simple. I'm awful, absolutely awful at packing. Maybe I'm not alone in this. I mean, when you travel, how do you pack? You know, what does your suitcase look like? I'm a disaster. I'm an absolute disaster when it comes to packing. And I say this because it never fails. I always overpack. You know, I have this sort of built-in tendency to think that I'm going to need a lot more than I actually do. You know, I treat a one-week trip as if it's going to last about a month. I pack too many clothes. You know, I have an outfit for just about every single type of occasion and every possible weather scenario. So I'm so glad my wife is here today, because whenever we're going somewhere, she gets so irritated with me. And she says things like, how many blue polo shirts do you really need? I don't know. I mean, what if I spill something on one of them, you know? I might need an extra. And then, of course, I also travel with a portable medicine cabinet. Now, even though most places I go, I mean, there's usually a Walgreens or something like that right down the street from where we're staying, but that doesn't matter. I still pack every kind of supplement or medication that could treat just about any type of problem that could arise on my trip. And I've also been known to even bring things like a first aid kit. So in my suitcase, I'd be ready for more than just a vacation or a business trip. I am ready to survive a zombie apocalypse if one breaks out. Now, it was the same thing when I left for that parliament 3 years ago. My wife, I remember, she was just shaking her head in disgust when she saw how jam-packed my suitcase was. Well, I got there, right? And I'm meeting a lot of people, I'm doing a lot of networking, and I kept getting a lot of free stuff. See, apparently, when you tell people that you're a seminarian, they just automatically assume that you're really poor. So people just start giving you things. So I was getting like t-shirts, free books, I mean, you name it, just all sorts of stuff. And suddenly, I knew that I was in deep, deep trouble. You know, suddenly all my packing for a doomsday scenario seemed pretty stupid. So in the end, I did the one thing that is so hard for so many of us to do. You sheepishly call your significant other and you tell them that you were right, I was wrong, I am an idiot. Fun, fun, fun. So I made that call, and I told her that I was going to have to buy a new suitcase. I actually had to skip a half day's worth of sessions to go out to Macy's and buy a big roller carry-on bag. So this was not one of my greatest moments. But I did learn my lesson, though. Now when I travel, and I'm about to travel again today, I let my wife do the packing for me. It's best to just leave it in the hands of an expert, somebody that actually knows what they're doing. Albie's good at packing for a trip because she just seems to inherently know the right amount of stuff to bring. Not too much, not too little, and she's also a master at making the best use of space. And she finds a way to make things fit so we never go over that dreaded 50-pound baggage limit. And so our gospel reading for the day, it also involves traveling. This chance encounter along the road by two men traveling in very different directions. One was traveling light, and the other was carrying a heavy load. And it's because of this one fact that the two of them were unable to go in the same direction and ultimately journey together. So today, then, I'm going to show where this young man went wrong and how we, in turn, can lighten our load so that we can move in the right direction through a process that Paul, in our earlier epistle reading, which I changed it up today, I apologize, but Paul, in our epistle reading, he calls it kenosis, or self-emptying. Now, when our gospel scene opens, he's running like you and I do when we're about to miss a flight. But in this case, he doesn't want to miss Jesus as Jesus passed through the town. So he comes running as fast and as hard as he could. And now this was a guy, let me tell you, that was used to traveling first class, or maybe even on a private jet. This story, it's also in Matthew and Luke's Gospels as well. And in Matthew's Gospel, it's said that he had great possessions. So he was very wealthy. The Gospel of Luke says that he was a ruler, meaning that he was both affluent and powerful. And I think it's safe to just sort of infer, based on what we read here, that this man was what we would call a go-getter. I mean, he was a self-assured high achiever. He knew what he wanted and he went for it. And apparently he'd been listening to Jesus and he decided to go for that. So, huffing and puffing in his expensive, wrinkle-free traveler's suit, he chases Jesus down, and he falls to his knees in genuine respect, and then he asks him what he thinks is the million-dollar question. Right off the bat, he says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" But pay close attention to the text. I mean, if we really look at this closely, we see he's treating it like it's another business transaction. He expected Jesus to prescribe some great deed that he could do that would just settle his accounts with God so he could punch his first-class ticket into eternal life. So this should be simple, right? Except Jesus decides to act like a TSA agent, maybe a loving TSA agent. After their talk about the commandments, he hits him with this proverbial sort of X-ray scanner, and he says, "You lack one thing. Go sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." Now, does Jesus' demand, does it sound kind of harsh to you guys? It sounds harsh to me. But the text is very clear about Jesus' intent. He makes loving eye contact with the young man. It says he loved him and that he was drawn to him. So his words were actually spoken in the tenderest of tones, but nevertheless, Jesus meant every word he said. This was the only way for that rich man. Now, I have to wonder, have any of you ever been in a situation that's like this? Does it sound familiar at all? How many times do we have a light of inspiration or a dream, something that speaks to us, and it might even be from God. We're so excited. We want to follow it. We want to pursue it. And so we pack up our suitcases and then we go running after God. But then we get there and we're moments away from just sort of rerouting our destination, and then suddenly we're terrified. I tell you, there's nothing so scary as being on the verge of actually realizing your dreams and then embarking on a new journey. I've been there. We hit the brakes and suddenly we start thinking, is this what I really wanted? Can I really do this? So we get scared. We get scared of any kind of change. And so that's exactly what happens here. This young man, he can envision a better life full of blessings and spiritual fulfillment. But the problem is, my friends, the real test of our talents, of our dreams, our faith, and our character, it's the fact that it's all in the doing. It's all in the doing, not in the wanting. I found it easy to just sit around and sort of dream dreams and think about what I'd like my life to be, but not actually doing anything about it. That's the bloody hard part. See, this guy was traveling with too heavy of a load to follow Jesus. He packed his suitcase to the brim with doubts and fears about what would happen if he followed Jesus. The fear of damaging his reputation, the fear of losing his friends, and most importantly, he was too attached to his stuff. He was a man who just couldn't let go of what he had. His whole identity was wrapped up in his material possessions. So here he is with this noteworthy and commendable piety, the heart and the dreams of a seeker who wanted more in his relationship with God. And yet he was weighed down because of his idiotically overpacked suitcase. So simply put, his materialism occupied the place of God in his life. And so he does what many of us do then when actually faced with achieving our dreams and we're asked to make such a drastic change. He goes away depressed. He's limping along with his heavy suitcase just rolling behind him. He goes back to the things he's always known. There's a perceived comfort and security and safety in that. He'll continue to accumulate more in terms of wealth and material possessions because that's what he knows. But that load, it's just going to keep getting heavier and heavier until he reached that dreaded 50-pound baggage limit. Now, we do this too. We overpack our suitcases. In all our lives, we have so many attachments and things that we cling to that we absolutely think we cannot live without. So we stuff them in there, whether they really fit or not. And so what this does, it not only weighs us down, but it also prevents us from putting anything new in there. So even if it's 100 times better than what we already have, we don't want to take that risk. And so the blessings that God is offering us, well, they just don't fit. But not so. Not so with Jesus. Jesus, you see, is traveling in the opposite direction. Jesus is traveling light. And I say that because after this encounter, he's quite literally beginning his march to Jerusalem and the cross. He's emptying everything out along the way. You know, we have a tendency to fill ourselves, but by contrast, he empties himself out. Now that's a powerful thing, isn't it? You know, this is precisely what Paul is talking about in our epistle reading, which I actually added as a complement to this lectionary's gospel lesson for the week. You know, this is what that Greek word, kenosis, or emptying, literally means. And kenosis is at the heart of everything that God does. It's at the heart of what it means that God is a holy Trinity. The Trinity is a kenotic relationship of self-giving love and relationship between the three persons of the Trinity. So each person of the Trinity gives to the other in this sort of beautiful divine dance. And creation itself, the fact that you and I and all of us, the fact that all life on this planet exists is an act of God's kenosis, of God's emptying. It's God emptying out his love and pouring it into the creation of life. The great theologian Dan Migliore, he puts it like this. He says, God is eternally disposed to create, to give, and share life with others. The welcome to others that is rooted in the triune life of God spills over, so to speak, into every act of creation. And then, of course, it all culminates in the cross. Paul says Jesus emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. See, Jesus had status. Jesus had power. Indeed, Jesus is equal to God, is God, come down in human flesh. But he comes down to us empty-handed, giving up everything for the good of humanity to the point of being crucified on the cross. So God in Christ empties out all his luggage on the road to Jerusalem to serve us and to reconcile us back to God. But there's more to it than just that. It's not just something that God does. It's not something that just Jesus does. No, it's Jesus says to this young rich man, this is your obstacle. This is what's preventing you from traveling light. I want you to empty out your suitcase. I want you to follow me on the path to Jerusalem, on the path of self-emptying and kenosis. See, true humility is more than just following some written commands. It's more than just a mental attitude. It requires a total reorientation from our natural inclinations to be self-serving to that of serving others as our primary concern. We're to share our whole lives. And that's the one thing. That's the one thing this guy couldn't do. He couldn't let go. He couldn't leave it behind. He couldn't travel light. And so it's no wonder then that Paul is exhorting these Philippian believers that he's writing to do the very same thing. See, in this letter, Paul was particularly targeting those who had some kind of power and prestige and influence in the local community, just like this young man had. You don't need all that in your suitcase, Paul's saying, if you want to truly follow Christ. Now, this might leave us all sort of squirming in our seats. Is this a universal prescription from Jesus and Paul? I mean, do we have to give up all our money and all our possessions? Well, no. It's a prescription to make the best use of space. We have to get rid of the excess. More specifically, we have to get rid of what is holding us back. Chances are in all our spiritual suitcases, we've got one or two items in there that are heavier than everything else. For some, it might be our wealth. For others, it might be our credentials or the titles that are behind our names. Or it could be our relationships, our patriotism, our work. It could even be our religion. We may have to pull something out of our suitcases if we want to follow Jesus and be part of this divine dance. So this is the first step in embracing kenosis as a spiritual practice. We learn to let go. We let go of the conditions, the reactions, the thoughts, the judgments, and the behaviors that impede us from being fully present with God and what God has for us. And just like it was with this rich man or with those Philippian Christians, this abandonment to divine providence, well, it might be scary. We might have to turn from what we thought was our security and our safety net and instead fall into the waiting arms of Christ. But my friends, that is the second step in embracing kenosis as a spiritual practice in our lives. We abandon ourselves to divine providence, and we trust in the safety and the security of God rather than what we try to create for ourselves. And see, when we commit to making these two steps, when we empty out our suitcases of all the things that we don't need, we find that Christ is always there, waiting for us, just like he was waiting for that rich man on the road in the eternal sanctuary of our hearts. He's there. And when we let go of these things from our false selves, we're awakened to Christ's presence inside us, and he invites us to come with him and to share in this unbreakable union that we have with Christ. So letting go, offering up, it is contrary to the way of the world. But when we empty our suitcases, we discover who we are in God. And that's 100 times better than all these things that we're clinging to. Through the practice of kenosis, we'll find restoration, healing, and wholeness. And in it, we'll find shalom. We'll find God's peace. And it's a peace that nothing in this world can shatter. And finally, we practice kenosis in our daily spiritual lives by self-offering. Instead of seeking to possess and to gain control, we actually find our real reward and our joy when we're serving others. We share what we have. Just as Jesus invites us to be a part of his divine dance, we empty our suitcases that are packed full of all that cultural individualism. And instead, we invite others into our hearts, and just as God's love overflows in us, we let that love flow out of us and to other people, to the people around us. This is the true abundance. This is the true wealth. The great mystic, Meister Eckhart, he sums up all of this that I've been teaching on today, and he says, to be full of things is to be empty of God. But to be empty of things is to be full of God. My brothers and sisters, Jesus has invited us to go on an amazing journey with him. And all we have to be willing to do is empty out some of our suitcases and be willing to travel light. Thanks be to God. Amen.